Do we have to push the got it button here?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going live now. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you. And apologies for the delay. We had a little bit of a technical malfunction, but we are up and running now. So thank you all for joining our November virtual town hall. In a moment, I will turn things over to our moderator, Good Government Illinois' David Orr, to welcome our panelists, Alderman Scott Waguespack and Alderman Matt Martin. Events like these are only possible with your support. Please visit goodgovernmentillinois.com to chip in so that we can keep holding our virtual town halls and hopefully get some in-person events coming up soon. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Orr.
Okay, welcome everybody. We'll try and speed it up here because of our little delay. One thing is that we're going to have a new feature with Good Government, hopefully starting tomorrow, called Good News Friday. It's just there's a lot of very good things that are going on with best practices around the country and here, and we're going to share some of those with you. So tonight, of course, we have Alderman Scott Waguespack and we have Alderman Matt Martin. One of these days, I'd love to get Pat Dowell because she has a good reputation for what she did on the budget. I also want to put in a thank you to Andre Vasquez, who, I'm not putting him in the show tonight, but we've had some good discussions about particularly some of the socialist and or progressive aldermen and some of the input that they had in this whole process. Okay, so let me go ahead. And I got to tell you one thing, though. I'm looking at this headline about Judge tells ex-Alderman Verdoliak to report to prison November 30th. Now, I'm not going to gloat over that right now, but it's just interesting if you look at all the charges behind it. So let me introduce Matt Martin. He's going to join us in a few moments. But in case you don't know, Matt is a newly elected alderman back in 2019. He was a civil rights attorney with the Illinois AG's office, focused a lot on police issues and worker issues. He also helped, I believe, to draft with the consent decree, the Chicago consent decree. It's also an interesting tidbit, if you don't know this about Matt. He used his saxophone skills to get a scholarship to Northwestern, and he later earned his law degree from Harvard. Lives in Lincoln Square with his wife and 2 kids. He's been on our shows before, as has Scott Waguespack, first elected back in 2007. I was also head of the Progressive Caucus for several years, from about 2015 to 19. Also an attorney from the Kent College of Law. Scott has a very interesting background because he was in the Peace Corps in Kenya, working on water projects. He also worked for the U.S. Department of State on some very tricky things related to war criminals in the Balkans, et cetera. Again, he's considered one of the smartest and hardest working aldermen. And he took over the Finance Committee, and the comparison between Ed Burke and Scott are pretty fascinating. And one little tidbit, if you haven't seen it, you might want to look up at some of the amazing changes in workmen's compensation, which was a real mess under Burke, and now they're saving a lot of money. So let's get started, Scott. Matt's going to join us, but there's a lot of talk about this new budget. I guess we said it passed easily. I guess you wouldn't think that, but it did pass. Since it's being called progressive, maybe the most progressive in a lot of circles, let's start a little bit with that. What are the key parts to it, and why do some people consider this budget progressive?
Well, thanks, David, for actually having me, and Morgan for setting this up. And I kind of appreciate you setting a little background too with Verdoliak when I think of Verdoliak 29 and Burke and kind of taking over the Finance Committee. I think every time I come on the show, and actually almost every few days that I talk to you, there's something new that pops up in the committee that we're changing. And, you touched on the workers' comp issue first, and we just got, auditing back from Deloitte. We've looked at over 120,000 records. It's interesting because we're starting to see some of the savings, but I think it's such a deep dive that we have to do that, in the first couple of years, we're only going to see a few $1 million worth of savings. But I think in the long run, as we kind of weed out the cases that I think they were probably seeing decade upon decade, we'll see more long-term savings on that. And just trying to make things more transparent, getting those reports out to the public through the comptroller's office instead of those sitting in the finance committee sight unseen. And that those will be performance audits as well as the finance audits or the fiscal audits. So I'm looking forward to really kind of getting that out there for people. And we'll be having a hearing coming up on workers' comp pretty soon. But this budget, I think we had a really good input early on. A lot of the progressive caucus dove into this budget, really provided a lot of the input I think that was necessary to complement what the mayor was already thinking about in terms of funding for mental health services, funding for homelessness, funding for issues that we hadn't seen, like gender-based violence, human trafficking. Those were a lot of issues that for many, many years, a lot of us were fighting to get funding in there. And in most budgets, if we were able to get one little piece of something in there, it was a victory, but that was pretty rare to get that. So when I looked at this budget, obviously it's a lot of ARP funds. When you look at the places that were
federal dollars,
yeah, federal dollars, what we're targeting, I think that's where we had discussions and arguments about how much could go into the different pockets and moving and shifting some of that funding around. But frankly, it was great to see progressive ideas already on the table and everybody at the table with constant meetings. Sophia King, obviously running the progressive caucus now, Matt, who's going to be on here, Andre, you mentioned. There were a lot of people that had great ideas that were put on the table. And while not everybody agreed on how much in each bucket, the fact that we were able to kind of push that and begin either new programming that we have to sustain or complementing things like mental health services, those were great options for us.
And don't forget my Alderman, Maria Haddon, and
yes, yeah,
minimum, the basic income. You'll be seeing information from us on that tomorrow.
And I think that one, that I know you were going to cover that, so I'll leave that to you. But there were a lot of great folks that were working on that program, which was kind of, it was brought up several years ago, and this is the first time we've had an opportunity to put it into the budget.
Okay,
David, sorry to interrupt, but Alderman Martin is here, so I'm going to join him in.
Oh, wow. Welcome, Matt. We're going to get your picture in here. There you are. Well, you got away earlier than I thought, so welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Glad to join you.
Okay, so we just actually started because we were a little late with our little technical problems. But Scott was just describing some of the progressive parts of the budget. And so let me follow up, particularly with you on why do people consider this a progressive budget? And then Matt, if you could, why don't you get into some of the back end? How did this happen? Scott had mentioned that you were a key player behind the scenes. So let's get into a little bit of how does this work? Let's get into the sausage making. How do you and other progressive aldermen, even non-so-progressive aldermen, how do you negotiate with the administration? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. How did this work out to be successful?
Absolutely. So I'll start with some of the points that I'm really excited about, and I know that many of my progressive colleagues are as well. Environmental protection and sustainability. So something over $200 million that's going to help us expand our electric vehicle charging infrastructure, set up composting pilot programs across the city for communities to bring yard waste and other things to come compost, an additional 15,000 trees that are going to be planted over the next 5 years, kind of a piece with the Urban Tree Canopy Advisory Board that Scott's been leading on recently, bike infrastructure, solar energy, even transit-oriented development. So environmental stuff is terrific. Housing and homelessness, so rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing for folks who need both short and long-term solutions, as well as more funding for affordable mixed-use developments, which we need in every part of our community. I'm personally excited about $25 million in increased funding for domestic violence. We know that those numbers have really gone in the wrong direction. A 3,000% increase in the number of folks texting the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, 100% increase in domestic violence related homicides. So the list goes on, thankfully, but those are some of the real highlights there. And then in terms of the sausage making, a lot of it happens within caucuses. So I'm a member of both the Black Caucus and the Progressive Caucus. There was substantial overlap in terms of the dozen or so issues that those two caucuses were prioritizing. And so I think what happens is in this year, even before the proposed budget came out, we had a series of working groups where a small group of aldermen would take turns talking with Pat Dowell, the chair of the budget committee, her staff, and members of the mayor's budget team to say, at a high level, here are issues that I want to see dealt with in an appropriate way, given what we're experiencing in our own wards. And so those were iterative conversations. They worked their way into the draft budget that the mayor proposed. And then those conversations really ramped up within caucuses to say, hey, we're going to really focus on, in the Progressive Caucus in particular, mental health resources, in particular for our public clinics. So we're seeing, I think, a 70% or so increase in the number of full-time positions that are going to be in the corporate fund. So that means even when the ARPA funds run out, they're still going to be there, which is absolutely critical to building up our public mental health infrastructure. Issues around housing, especially the preservation of single room occupancy buildings, hugely critical as well, especially with these ARPA funds in place. And then also issues around transparency and accountability. Myself, Alderman Lespat, and others have been talking about, well, these funds sound great. Like you list them off, you read them in a press release, fantastic. What do we do to ensure they're actually getting spent as quickly and efficiently as possible? So there's now a subcommittee within the budget committee to be able to take up these issues on a regular basis to ensure that we're having public hearings where there's public participation in ways that we haven't even seen before, in addition to public comment, and then a public facing portal like what the Inspector General's office has.
And that's never been done before.
Correct.
That I'm aware of, right? So in other words, because in the real world, sometimes when people pass budgets, but maybe things not quite follow up all the way, or sometimes the funds get shifted. So you're saying now the aldermen have created something in a subcommittee under Pat Dowell, where they will have responsibility for kind of pushing to make sure the funds are spent in a timely manner and where they're supposed to be.
That's right. And don't get me wrong, this isn't a panacea. That subcommittee itself, is necessary, but not sufficient in terms of getting those funds out in the ways that we want. But look, I think we hear from a lot of folks that this is a generational opportunity that we have. We need to think outside the box. And I think that the creation of a subcommittee to focus just on the Chicago Recovery Plan, so the ARPA funds, some corporate funds, and then a lot of the bond funds that helped in us invest in housing and environmental issues, among other things, those are going to be the topics of conversation with it in those hearings.
Let me just ask both of you, but I will shift it back to Scott for a moment on this one. We have several questions tonight from people who were, let me put it the way, like Bob Ginsburg has asked this, and he's a kind of a budget expert, and Joel Inwood and some others. So the questions are like this, much to applaud the budget, but the key is, will it be maintained for several years if, of course, there's not federal funds or there's not some new sources of revenue? So that's one. A lot of people have questions about that going into the future. So do you want to start with that, Scott? Or
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I would say is we better find some other sources of revenue. And I think the most important one is obviously the graduated income tax, trying to shift us away from a total reliance on property taxes and other fines and fees. So I don't know when the next crack at that is going to be, but I think that's very important to really kind of shift our focus to that so that we can, create that revenue stream to sustain a lot of these programs. So, Matt brought up a lot of other great programs. I mean, this is the thing about this budget. There's so much in it. It's almost it is a little bit unbelievable. When you kind of go through the list of things that are in here, it is a far cry from what we saw in the 2010 funding from the federal government. The transparency level was far less than what it is right now. We did see funding going for housing there, but it was put into these funds. It kind of, I wouldn't say disappeared very quickly, but it was eaten up very quickly, and that was it. And I think what we're trying to do here is figure out which of these programs will be sustainable. Where can we find new revenue streams to keep them going? The funding that we have for ARP basically goes through 2024. We're keeping a little bit back just in case the pandemic takes a wrong turn again. But I think the important thing for us, what Matt was saying, is having this oversight. It's going to come through the city council. We have a good budget director, I think, who is trying to answer a lot of the questions up front. Maybe Matt recalls the number. I'm pretty sure it was over 1,000 requests for information. Was that?
Yeah,
some crazy number of requests for information from aldermen, and they got every one of them before the budget. They came back. Now, some of them came in the day of or the day before, but throughout that process, they were really pushing it. And I think what people were focused on from a lot of the things that I saw was, okay, you're putting that money in, but I'm starting to think, a year, 2 years, 3 years ahead, how can we sustain that? So I think Bob and Joel have good points there about making sure, we get these other revenue streams to sustain it. We're going to have some tough choices, but I think we all know, Matt mentioned domestic violence is one of them. We've seen an increase in that throughout the pandemic, just general violence and reactionary situations for a lot of people, a lot of mental health issues. And so we know those are going to have to be sustained long time. Arts funding, it always takes the hit. There is arts funding here, but those are those tough choices we're going to have to make as we move forward. And hopefully we can get things like the hotels back up, tourism back up, entertainment, so that we can put money into those areas as well as the debt and the pensions.
Well, I have to say, when I listen to you guys talk, I'm really jealous because remember, I was in city council 4 years before Harold was elected. And if we ask for anything, they basically give us the finger and laugh at us.
Yeah.
Whether it was Burke or Mel or whoever it was. But we had to do an awful lot of digging to find out stuff. Let me follow up because C.J. O'Hare had asked two questions. One about the big boost in forestry. And I think Matt kind of asked, he mentioned the money, and I'm just assuming it's because part of the pandemic, remember, people weren't working. We got way behind on the trees. Trees is something a lot of people in neighborhoods are really concerned about. So I assume the increase is just because they want to catch up.
That's right. Yeah. So I'll give a shout out to Andre Vasquez, our colleague in the 40th Ward, who is really beating the drum on this. And so we're going to be up to 30 crews next year. That's what's budgeted. A really significant increase. I don't remember the current number off the top of my head, given the number of vacancies, but it's fewer than 20. So this is going to be huge. And one, this is a core service, right? When they're in, it's a safety issue. We need to make sure that we're not just reactive in how we're trimming trees, but proactive. So this will move us to a place in the coming years as we continue to invest in the Bureau, where I know probably a lot of folks who are watching this either live or after the fact will say, so frustrating when I see my neighbor's tree trimmed. I put in a tree trim request recently and they won't come to, even though they're on the same block, they have to go somewhere else. So this is going to help with that. And then also, this is an environmental issue. We know that we're struggling with our tree canopy right now. Again, kudos to Scott for spearheading the fight on the Urban Tree Canopy Advisory Board. And this is going to, even though the board wasn't up and running by the time we were able to pass this budget, I'm sure they would have said, we need more resources in that crew, because for non-emergency trims in my neck of the woods, it can be upwards of a year. And that isn't because folks in the Bureau are slouching. It's actually the exact opposite. When we had the derecho come through last August, I mean, they were working crazy overtime to make sure that folks could walk on sidewalks, could drive down the streets, and just be safe when stuff was hitting folks' homes. So it's an incredibly important Bureau, and this is really getting them close to the level where we need them to be so that we can maintain our tree canopy and then hopefully expand it with new plantings as well.
Okay, let me turn on to perhaps one of the less popular parts about this quote successful budget. Okay, let's talk about property tax increases. We had several different questions, and some people actually made reference to massive increases and so forth. Let's really talk about it, exactly what it's for, because we're talking about a little less than $80 million. And if I understand it right, I think, and maybe hearing from you, Scott, before, is people need to understand exactly what this is for, because whether the number is 75, 77, whatever it is, that does not mean that everybody's paying taxes on that. So help me out with that. How do you break down this property tax increase, and why would a nonpartisan group like Budget and Tax Accountability, a nonpartisan group, argue this is very sound fiscal policy?
Well, I think so. The stability and predictability that I think comes with it, and more of the fairness on that side of things. When we talk about Fritz Kagi, we're talking about trying to right-size the system, to set a system up so that people know what's coming, they know what their bill is going to look like, and I think that's what we're trying to get to with this. So when we're talking about the 79 million, we're not talking about hitting the whole city with that $80 million bill. If you break it up, in reality, I think it's only 23 million, almost 23 million is for an increase of property taxes for the whole city, like across all taxpayers. Another large chunk of that, about 20.
I'm sorry. So, and that part, let's say that 23 million you're talking about for the average $250,000 house, although, what is that, just $3 or $4?
Yeah, well, they say it's $1.50 per month. So when you add that up over 12 months, if that's kind of the average, you can kind of make it out. But that's on a $250,000 house. Obviously, some wards, Matt and I, we're gonna see some much bigger increases. But I think that's something that we look at, and when we vote on this thing, we have to look at the increased cost of government over time. Now, if we're doing a job of really trying to reduce these structural imbalances, really focus on right-sizing government, fixing government, this all kind of plays into it. But the other third of that is for new properties coming online. So any new house that gets built, that essentially is a house that is finally coming onto the tax rolls after getting built, new condo buildings, things like that. So the one that would affect people in 2023 would be, and this doesn't start to kick in until then, is the 23 million. And so it's broken down into 3 chunks. And the only other thing, Matt can jump in, but the only other thing I would say is this. I brought up on several other either radio or TV, whatever it is, there was always a lot of hand-wringing, gut-wrenching decisions that had to be made, because what the other mayors would do since I've been here is wait. They would never do any increases until it was basically 0 hour. So under Rahm, we had a $543 million increase from over like a 3 to 4 year period. And that you can make that out, if it's 3 years, we're talking well over 100 million increase. Daley did it a couple times as well with $300 million increases. So we would wait until the last second and then put it on Alderman and say, you need to vote for this increase and you have no choice. Nobody likes to raise property taxes, but I think a CPI actually eases it in so that there's more stability and predictability for people to know what that increase is on the city side.
And back to you, Matt, or you don't have to answer this, but related to what we're talking about, one of the questions was, why did we use this quote federal, if that's the right word, CPI index? There's more than one index. Do we think it's a sound reason why we're using that one?
Yeah, my understanding is that that's largely consistent with our other big taxing bodies like the Park District and the Chicago Public Schools. And so for folks, I would recommend that they check out Chicago Tribune article that John Byrne had written about this piece, saying that there's a federal CPI that most of our taxing bodies use and the city is going to be using moving forward, but also that there's a more locally based CPI. And then some years the CPI locally is somewhat lower, as was the case this year, but it's essentially a piece around uniformity when we're talking about, well, what are our other taxing bodies using in terms of calculating CPI? The proposed decision and ultimately what we move forward with was that what we do at the city level in terms of our city budget, corporate fund, that mirror what our sister agencies are doing.
Okay, so I make sure that's an important point, that this decision, even if people don't like it, is by following this index, it means that there's going to be some increase. And all budgets, even though of course we'll all be working to try and save money where we can, but you're going to raise money for city workers, police and fire, costs to the city go up. So the notion that we always have to start all over and we're always dealing with these deficits and so forth. So that's the reason why there's this increase. And what Scott is maintaining, if I understand it right, is that 23 million roughly, which is part of the index, that is shared by all taxpayers. Not the other money we're talking about are things like for TIFs. You have to capture ahead of time some of these properties so they'll go on the tax rolls, and that's not going to hurt poor people. You know what I mean? That's actually going to help. So when we use this $75 to $80 million figure, it's a bit of I don't know. It's just not accurate in terms of how much. So if someone would argue there's a massive tax increase, nobody wants a tax increase, but it's simply not. Let me jump for a moment because I think of just some of the things that you just said. Okay, if I understand it right, tell me, let's talk politics a bit. It seems like the Progressive Caucus, the majority of the Progressive Caucus supported this budget. The Black Caucus, most members supported this budget. The Latino Caucus, I think, and I've not seen all numbers, supported this budget. If there's any single group, and I hate to put it in this terms, the only group, even though it's not a caucus, that didn't support it, clearly a majority would be white aldermen. Okay, and yet, unless my memory is going with my age, I thought most of these same white aldermen, including a guy named Burke, didn't they support these $543 million increases?
Well, yeah, they did.
I mean, I'm only asking that. I'm not trying to make fun. I'm saying, why is that? Why would Latino, progressive, Black caucuses all support this budget, and then powerful, traditionally more white wards oppose it?
Well, I think part of it, and when you're listening to the questions coming from people during these budget hearings, they're lengthy hearings, but they're kind of fun to sit there and hear what everybody else has to say about their parts of the city or their thoughts. I thought that there was a lot of animosity there on certain issues. I think the biggest one being universal basic income, and that was the biggest pushback that I kept hearing. There was also a pushback on the CPI, and I thought, that can't be too much since you guys did vote for the 500, the 300s back in the day, and it didn't seem like, those were too difficult of votes. But I think what I was hearing was the basic income pilot.
Sorry, but Alderman, Scott, don't aldermen get increases based on CPI?
Oh yeah,
Take them?
Yeah, I think I don't think there was. Well, I can't speak for everybody. I'm not sure who said no to those who voted no. and some of the aldermen had different reasons for voting no, but the one that I kind of heard most was UBI. So
Okay.
I'm not
Well,
really sure why they would.
I'm not attacking them. I'm just saying it's interesting because they've been on this index. In other words, if people don't know, you used to have to vote for tax increases, and now you kind of get them based on the index. Okay, that's a clever way. That's happened with the state legislature, and I have to take blame for that because way back in around '94, I passed legislation in Springfield which did away with the pay raises like we used to do in the county and the city. What we used to do is, like Matt, you'd get elected in February or April, and before you were sworn in, the alderman would pass a tax increase after you were elected. And in the county, the same thing. After you were elected in the March primary, which the Democrats almost won every seat, then they passed, I'm sorry, take it back. In November, the first Tuesday in November, when you're elected a county commissioner, before you take office December 1st, you'd pass a tax increase. And there was lots of stuff way back a time that we call a midnight pay raise, and I was furious about it. I don't know how we got it through Springfield, but we did. So that meant that throughout the state, you could not pass a tax increase unless it's at least 6 months before the new term. And I know for one, I'm not very popular because of that. In fact, I didn't get a pay increase as county clerk for a long time. But anyway, enough of that. Let's go back to, we don't have to talk about the politics. Let's get into this issue a little bit about, remember, some people say, well, why do we have to give the banks money, or particularly Chase? What's that all about, and how does that relate to sound fiscal policy, borrowing, the bond ratings? How does all that fit in? Whoever wants to jump on that.
Well, I could start out on it. We did borrow money, and I think whenever you borrow money, it's just a fundamental thing to pay it back. And we did borrow the money to help us get through the pandemic. I mean, that was pretty much the bottom line. And even though we have a good chunk of this money coming back, I know that some folks argued that, we either shouldn't pay it back or portions of it. And I thought that I thought that the ability to pay it back helped us on the bottom line with our ratings. I mean, that to me was the ultimate thing. We were able to use funding to get away from scoop and toss. And scoop and toss is just refunding bonds over and over again to push our current debt back or further out into the future. And that was really killing us financially over and over again. I mean, we were seeing vast amounts of interest tacked on. The rating agencies didn't like scoop and toss. And I think this kind of just helps us budget for the future to pay off our debt, pay into our pension funds, and get away from the old poor way of financing. So part of that was to essentially make that payment, don't default on it, and pay back the money that we owe to the bank.
Okay. Anything, Matt? We can keep going.
Yeah. So I think, as Scott mentioned, we were doing two things. One is to undo the scoop and tossing that was proposed last year and enacted in order to get us through the year, to avoid laying off tremendous number of city workers. And then the second was a short-term note that would come due at the end of this year. And so if you're not going to do that, well, what are your various options? Then it might be like a second scoop and toss. And I understand the point that a lot of folks were making insofar as there's so many folks in every single one of our communities who's hurting. And if you could, you would use every single cent from the feds on direct supports to our communities in one form or another. Because is this a perfect budget? Even though I think that it's a huge step in the right direction, a lot of ways. Well, no, it's not a perfect budget. That's of course not possible. A lot of it's eye of the beholder. But if the idea is we want to make sure that both short and long term, we're freeing up as much money as we can to support our communities. Well, as Scott was indicating, if you get into the continual practice of scooping and tossing, it's essentially like you're constantly refinancing your mortgage in ways where you're ultimately going to be paying more money to the banks in the long term. So is it a situation where would it be great if the banks were willing to unilaterally charge us less interest, especially recalling that a dozen or so years ago, our broader country taxpayers came in and bailed out the banks based on their poor decisions? Well, that would have been great for them to do. And we also know from a lending standpoint, they're definitely not doing what they need to be doing right now when it comes to investing in all of our communities equally, to say nothing of really remedying the effects of redlining and blockbusting and restrictive covenants that they were either active in or complicit in. But at the end of the day, we do want to make sure that we're making the sorts of decisions that will maximize the amount of money that we can put into our communities.
And I hope that point that you're making is something that people try and follow up on. What I mean by that is we don't have to in other words, a lot of times, hard times, you said a lot of people have hard times. We even tell our workers sometimes, sorry, you're going to get a very small increase this time, or your medical bills are going to go up, whatever it may be. I think we need to focus more on the amount of money attorneys in general, bonding houses, all sorts of folks. Why do we just accept that we give them $400 an hour? I'm just guessing on that. I'm saying I do think that should be looked at and pushed at, because they should tighten their belts a little bit too. Let me ask.
I'm sorry. I want to interrupt and just really underscore that point, which is there's so much additional work that we can do around banking and the intersection between that and city finances. Because I know Scott's brought it up. My predecessor, Mayor Pawar, has brought it up in terms of to what extent can we move some of these practices in-house when we're paying huge fees to outside entities to do things that potentially we could do in-house. There's also been lots of calls for public banking options. You could count me as one of many who are really hopeful that we can explore what that looks like. Places like California, one of our terrific peer states, they or at least one of their cities, they're setting up a panel to explore what public banking can look like to help ensure that there's more affordable housing, to ensure that we're addressing the climate crisis as aggressively as possible. So I do think that we're in the midst of really reconsidering our relationships with our banking institutions, given how well they continue to do and how much we all are continuing to struggle.
Boy, I hope so. I remember when I became county clerk in 1990, the previous clerk was not getting any interest for the hundreds of millions of dollars that we had of the bank's money. No interest, period. Anyway, okay, Christopher, those are bad old days, guys. You guys are having it better. But Christopher White asked, and I think the question is asking personally if you would either, it says, will you meet with Housing Initiative Coalition concerning expanding housing preservation pilots? So I just want to lay that out there. I think Christopher White, representing these groups, is hoping that at least the two of you be willing to talk to them. So.
I'll start. Oh,
I'm
go ahead.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll start. Absolutely. So our office, probably best way to get in touch with us, info@aldermanmartin.com. We are routinely having conversations with folks around different preservation initiatives, whether it's single room occupancy buildings. As I mentioned earlier, we're getting $5 million. We got a $5 million commitment just for the next fiscal year. 2 and 3 flat preservation is hugely important. The DePaul Institute of Housing Studies recently came out with a report saying that Lincoln Square and North Center, 2 of the biggest neighborhoods in my ward, lost collectively 10% of their affordable housing units. You're talking primarily deconversion of 2 and 3 flats into single family homes. So always welcome conversations with folks around how we can preserve housing, especially ones that are more modestly priced, because that's so incredibly important as we want to make sure our areas remain as diverse as possible.
Yeah, and I would just say that, Matt had brought up earlier the lending equity ordinance, and that was a lot of work that we did with Harry Osterman too. But we've been working with the Housing Policy Task Force on that. A lot of folks from different housing agencies. Anthony Simpkins was the former deputy over at Housing. Marissa Novara now, who's doing a lot of stuff. And we already, we really started working on getting more transparency in lending from all the banks, as Matt was mentioning. So we do continue to meet with those organizations. Even throughout the budget, we were kind of pushing this thing forward, continuing to move the ball with the comptroller, who has made a ton of changes to, I think, the way we're going to see this transparency now and, pretty far into the future, just to add on to that.
Let me ask something that is a little confusing to me, and it may be a little touchy, so you can dodge it if you want. We had a pretty significant vote, maybe 35-15, something like that, of people actually supporting the budget. And they discussed it. We support the budget. But on the other hand, we had a greater number of people that did not support some of the amendments. And remember, things are done a little differently than when I was there. But weren't many of these amendments how we paid for it? So I guess I'm asking why that disparity there, if it's simply a political reality that, I'm going to vote for the budget, but some of my constituents don't want me to do this, so I'm going to vote against the amendments. Is that, if people don't understand government politics, often there are things that aren't consistent. Even legislation sometimes, when people can't quite agree, they pass the legislation, but they're still not exactly sure what they mean. Any thoughts on that? Or I don't want to I'm getting into the.
That's really getting into the weeds. And, when you're sitting there hearing the votes come in, there were people who were on some of the votes, but then they weren't on the other one. And we took a lot of votes. We really broke it down. And yes, some people voted for some of the programmatic votes, but not for the funding for it. And vice versa. I think, again, some people couldn't stomach the fact that they were voting for universal basic income, and voted against that, but then, voted for the tax ordinance, or the revenue ordinance. So it was kind of a mixed bag. And I don't recall if I don't think everybody voted straight down the line on each one of those packages.
No,
I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly who on each.
Okay, it was interesting. Let's just go back. We have just a little bit of time left, but let's go about the basic income stuff. Let's explain that a little bit more. And we know it's a kind of a pilot program. It's actually at this point just for 1 year, and I believe it's of all the cities that are trying to do that, I think the amount we're talking about is the largest of any major American city. Again, one more time, what is it? And how are we going to give out these awards? It's okay. What's the heart of this? Why are we doing this? Minimum income.
You want to grab that one?
Yeah, I'll start off. Yeah.
And who do we want to thank for it too? I think a lot of your colleagues, the Progressive Caucus, have been talking about this. I know Maria got a nice picture in the Tribune. I think Carlos was working on that for some time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's obviously a collective effort. And so I think this dates back to before my tenure in office, when there was a working group that was put together to explore a number of potential initiatives that could be used to help working individuals and working families. And this was one that came out of that. My predecessor, Mayor Pawar, was one of several big champions for this. And so what is going to be in next year's budget is that 5,000 Chicagoans will get $500 a month. And so we're still in the coming months. I'm sorry?
Is that just adults? So it could
That's right.
be for the family. So we actually help them. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so with the idea is that at bottom, look, we have lots of different cash assistance programs. We did this from a rental standpoint, right? Several periods throughout the worst of the pandemic. And at bottom, we know that we're really losing our middle class, and that it's never been more a tale of two cities than it is today. And that when you're talking about the skyrocketing costs of childcare, when you're talking about how much housing is costing, transportation and food, that there's a certain, just like real basic floor that we want to make sure that folks are starting from. It's a reason why we have Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And as our economy grows and changes, and as you see this emerging bifurcation in terms of the very wealthy and those of very modest means, that this is one of a number of programs that have captured the attention and imagination, not just of policymakers in Chicago, but all across the country. And so, as you mentioned, David, this is going to be, to date, the biggest universal guaranteed income pilot in the country. And the data that is coming out of that will, I hope and expect, inform what will be happening moving forward in Chicago as well as the country. And so, as you mentioned, in addition to Maria Haddon in the 49th Ward, Sophia King in the 4th Ward, Gil Villegas in the 36th Ward, really helped spearhead this conversation recently. And then folks like Carlos Ramirez Rosa in the 35th Ward, Mike Rodriguez in the 22nd, among many others, have been really helping push this across the finish line.
Good.
Yeah, and I would just add, we did PPE for restaurants. We do SPIF programs. We do TIF programs. Some programs have more guidelines or parameters than others. We're doing a microloan program. We do want to have some guidelines about where the money goes, so you can kind of track and see how effective it is and where you can improve the program. But like Matt said, we do child tax credits, we do stimulus checks, and what's the difference? And if those people are able to take it and buy food at the local store, pay the rent, whatever it might be, those are funds that are going right back into the economy, and that they're going to spend them.
Yeah, which is a critical thing for people that maybe have some more conservative approach to it. Like you just said, if people really looked at it carefully, we spend an extraordinarily high money on high income things, whether it's banks or businesses. There's amazing, whether it's tax breaks or other ways that we funnel money to the very wealthy. The one thing about programs like this, like the stimulus has been wonderful for so many people to survive the last year and a half.
Like Matt said, we also bailed out the banks last time. So how many trillions was that? And we're talking sort of a drop in the bucket here.
But what helps any economy is when people, particularly those who are not so well off, they get any kind of assistance, they spend it. Where many of our multimillionaires, they just put money in the bank. And spending is what generates a good economy. Okay, let me ask this, and maybe it's kind of a way of getting close to closing. And we kind of talked about it, but Jamie Hausler, basically asked, we kind of touched on it, but there's a chance for you to kind of sum up. What is the greatest impact and the benefit to our area this budget may have?
I'll start off. I don't want to single out just one, because I think that there are a lot of things that have the potential to be incredibly transformative. One that maybe I'll rephrase it, that I'm especially excited about are the housing supports in here, because of the ways in which when you provide folks with stable housing that has so many benefits, economic, mental health benefits, and intangible ones. So when we're talking about rapid rehousing for folks who are domestic violence survivors and they need to get out of their home as quickly and as safely as possible, to have a place where they can land that isn't just a shelter in short term, but for several months as they get back on their feet, that's hugely helpful. Permanent supportive housing for individuals maybe who have chronic mental health issues, co-occurring substance abuse issues as well, to be able to have that permanent supportive housing environment and to have wraparound services. That means at the end of the day, instead of being homeless or housing in an unstable way, you have stable housing. Instead of going to the ER when health issues arise, you have that stability where you're more likely to go to a primary care provider. That housing can also help ensure that you or loved ones can go to school regularly if they're school-age kids, hold a job more consistently. This is huge. This has the opportunity to really be a greater return on investment than most other things. So if we do this well, and a lot of this stuff, because I know that there were some questions at the outset around how like fiscally responsible is this? A lot of that money for rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, that's to purchase properties, to rehab them in ways that are kind of one-time in nature, but will have ongoing benefits month after month, year after year, well after ARPA is completed, if we get this right. So that's one I would definitely encourage folks to keep their eyes on.
Let me just, before I go back to you, Scott, I did miss a couple questions here. It's two questions on the police. One of them from Julia Klein is, again, how do we slash the police budget by 1/2 and put it in new violence prevention because the police don't do anything? A different related police question from Paul Poi is, where does police reform fit in to this budget? So if either one of you want to talk to either one of those questions at all, I don't think, I know there's a lot of confusion over, quote, defunding the police. You know, I mean, I'll just start out saying, you got to remember where the votes to support. There is not that kind of public support for basically defunding the police or taking half their budget away, because the vast majority of money for police, whether you like them or not, and we certainly have our share of bad police in the city, but a vast majority of the money is going into police and
Personnel too. Yeah, mostly personnel.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, you can't just go in and just cut out all that personnel overnight. And I think what the mayor and a lot of aldermen are trying to do is look, you know, obviously we need the reforms coming in. We're going to have funding for community oversight and policy making, which is going to start to transform that. The public safety inspector general with their added, you know, complement of what the policy should be. And I think what you're going to see is better management, or should see better management of the whole police department. And then maybe over time you start to, you know, it starts to shrink body wise as you improve, you know, how all those people are working out there on the street every day. We just worked with AFSCME. I think Matt signed on to it too, to look at civilianization of good portions of the police department. You know, we have basically a lot of officers who carry a gun who go and file paperwork. And we've been told year after year in past budgets that, well, we need them to, you know, they're the only ones who can file paperwork. And we look at it and say, no, that's probably a job that somebody from AFSCME could do, and create a position there to, you know, reduce the reliance on police officers. That's one little thing. But I think, you know, the focus too on officer wellness, there's funding for that. You know, they see trauma every day and they need to be trained. They need to be working with social workers and mental health workers to try to stay away from the approach that we've taken for decades, which is to just go in with guns blazing and move away from that as well. So I think there's some great funding opportunities here that are on the table to, you know, have mental health responders instead of police responders to mental health crises. And we've got to build that up to shift away our reliance completely on the police force.
Okay. Anything on that, Matt?
Yeah, I think Scott's right. We have a real diversity of opinion within the city and within each of our communities around what proper funding of various departments should look like, including the police department. I mean, I remember back to last year following the release of the murder video of George Floyd, folks taken to the streets, and budget surveys that we put out just a few months later, where over 90% of the folks who took our budget survey wanted to see a decrease in the police department's budget to free up more money for social service programs. And that wasn't unique to our survey. I think the mayor's survey for the entire city had somewhat similar results. I think like maybe 87% approximately.
Yep.
And then we've also seen as some of the more violent crimes like carjackings and shootings have persisted over the last year, that folks are saying, well, I want my community to be safer. What does that look like? And what I take away from all of those different conversations is that folks at bottom want the same thing, which is a safer community. And we need to figure out, as you mentioned, David, what are the ways to get there where we can get a majority of support for city council, especially around budget issues. So to have crisis workers and paramedics respond to nonviolent 911 mental health calls for service, like Scott mentioned, we're doing that. That's great. And many of our other peer cities are doing that. We're talking about violence prevention programming. We're investing more and more money in that every single year. And we're already seeing the fact that when you have folks going proactively to the homes of individuals who are at a high risk of being involved in gun crime as a perpetrator or as a victim, telling them, hey, you've probably experienced trauma. Let us give you access to therapy if you'll take it. We have a paid job training program if you're unemployed or underemployed. If you stick with us for those 18 months, you'll have a paid job at the end of that. That is successful here in Chicago. Northwestern University Chicago, they've already run the data indicating that whether it's CRED, whether it's READY, whether it's CP4P, that the data is there. As Scott also mentioned, civilian oversight for the police department. All of that stuff is there. We need to make sure that we're scaling up and continuing to think as innovatively as possible, because even with this diversity of opinion, I think we've already been able to get a lot done over the last year plus, and we know what a lot of those next steps are moving forward.
Let me put my summary to what both of you said. Politically, it's hard to talk so much about defunding or whatever, but the reality of Chicago is that you have done many of the things that people want. I mean, we're not there yet, but meaning that, again, like you mentioned, mental health advisors, all these various programs where in theory, what it does is help the police so they're not in all these situations. And in many cases, the police are not the ones to be intervening anyway. So trying to stay away from the more electrified battle over maybe the word. Chicago has done a lot of the things, and you mentioned there's a lot of funding in here to keep doing other things. So I do think you've answered Paul's question pretty good about how police reform can fit into this budget. So let me just ask, because we're pretty good at staying on time, but it's not perfect. Any closing words? I do think this is a pretty fascinating thing. Politics often can be ugly. This is, like we say, sausage making. But I think there's quite a few people that did a really pretty fine job and kind of pulling this off. Now, of course, it helps to have the federal dollars. But again, we needed federal dollars because we lost so much in the pandemic. But closing thoughts?
Maybe I'll start. I think has been discussed in more ways than one. This is a unique opportunity. I mean, I don't anticipate, regardless of how long I'm in city council and city government, to ever see something like ARPA. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't know that we'll see something like this in my professional lifetime. So I want to make sure that we get this right as much as we can. It's not going to be perfect. There are going to be lots of hurdles that we have to overcome, because we've never seen something like this in our lifetimes, at least my lifetime in Chicago. But it's just so important that we have everybody like working together as much as they can. Reach out to our offices. Let us know what questions you have for advocates, but also just regular residents, regardless of how much expertise you have. Continue to let us know where you think this money is best spent. And when you see something that's not being effective, you need to let us know, because I want to make sure when we're looking back, not just next year, this time next year, but in 5, 10, 15 years, that we can feel just as good about the implementation as we did about how we decided to allocate those funds, which, we did over the last month or so.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think this is just a really sound and very solvent budget, based on all the ones I've seen in the past. Since basically the 2008 budget was my first one, and I did see what happened with that 2010 budget. There wasn't as much transparency as we have here, and I think that transparency, there are a lot of battles. There's a lot of articles out there. There's a lot of fights. The mayor likes to fight for what she wants to see in a budget. The aldermen do, organizations do, labor unions do. Everybody was at that table looking for ways to not fight over the money, but to say, like, look, here are the things where we feel it's most important for this money to be spent in this way and on these topics. And I really found it to be it was difficult, and we got it done earlier, but there was everybody, I think, came together knowing that we've spent the last year and a half, more than a year and a half, going through this global pandemic. And honestly, it has been the toughest 2 years I think anybody has ever gone through, and certainly in government. Everybody was trying to work through this thing. We were trying to survive with the budget that we had. We saw the revenues dwindling. I mean, they just, not even dwindling, they just fell off the cliff. So to get this ARP funding, and frankly, thank God Biden got in and was able to kind of move this stuff. And obviously we could use more with the infrastructure funds. But I think everybody on this budget did an excellent job, almost everybody, because not everybody came to the table. Not everybody voted for it, which is fine. You pick and choose where you want to pick your battles. But I think everybody in those caucuses that you mentioned, Matt talked about it, everybody was fighting very hard to get the most important things they felt necessary in here, and we got a lot of it in. There was very few instances where I think people felt that they didn't have a good portion of what they wanted in this budget. But for the future, I think Bob and maybe it was Joel who asked that question about, is it sustainable? Right. We all want it to be sustainable. I don't know if it can be unless we can get those other revenue resources at the table. But I know it was great to work with everybody and, at the same time, do our other jobs to keep moving the city forward. So even though there's battles, even though there's fights, even though things can get kind of nasty in the trenches there, I think everybody was trying to move the city forward in the best way possible. And I think it worked out fine.
Okay, one final story before I thank you, because you mentioned you not only did all that, but you did it the budget early. So I have to remind everybody, but way back in 1984, when Eddie Verdoliak, who I mentioned at the beginning of the show, is on his way to jail again, when he was intent on wrecking as much as he could here in Washington in every way possible, it was December 31st, and the budget deadline was a few hours away. My oldest son was about to be born. My wife was in the hospital. 9:30 at night, and I'm Harold, I got to go. My wife's going to have a baby. And well, you got to wait a little longer. We don't quite have the votes. And a few minutes later, they called back and said, okay, you can go. We got the votes. And kind of rushed back, but partly because of the delay, my oldest son, Jeffrey, was not born until the next day. So he was the first to arrive in '85 in Evanston, partly because Eddie Verdoliak held us up. But let me thank Matt and Scott. You are, and there's other good aldermen, but you are looking at two of the smartest and hardest working aldermen. And there's some others, but you guys are way up there in terms of the energy you put in, and you're articulate, and we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you all.
Thanks, David.
And Morgan, did you have any parting words, or are we done? We're
We're
streaming.
done.
You can tell your friends, again, if they want to see this, I want to see these talented two aldermen speaking. It's on our Facebook page, Good Government Illinois, and you can, it'll be there for indefinite.
Jane Heron asked me if it was going to be on the website too. Is that just a link to the Facebook page, or was it a separate?
Yeah,
Same thing. Same thing.
Go ahead,
we'll
Laura.
upload it to our YouTube page as well and link to it on the Good Government Illinois website. But the fastest way to see it is right here on Facebook, on the Facebook page.
I'll let her
Okay,
know.
thank you, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you for all your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but we appreciate it.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Care.